Hi again, welcome to Lesson 9, which is on advantages and disadvantages questions. So lessons 6, 7, 8, and 9, it doesn't really matter which order you watch them in. They're on discussion, opinion, problem solution, and advantages. Disadvantages questions. I would, however, watch Lesson 5 before you watch any of these lessons because there's some important information in Lesson 5 about direct questions which you can really apply to any essay that you write. So if this is the first question you happen to come across, have a look at lesson 5 first. So advantage, disadvantages question can be a bit confusing because there are a couple of different types with different wordings asking you to do different things when you respond to the question. And there are essentially two main types and then a kind of third, let's call it a phantom type, where I'm not really sure that it's a real question type, but it seems to pop up a lot on the internet in various places, and there's no reason why you couldn't find a question like this. So I'm going to mention all three types of advantage, disadvantage questions. So one is just being asked to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of something. One is being asked to discuss whether you think something has more advantages or more disadvantages, or whether one situation is more advantageous or more disadvantageous. And then this third kind of phantom type question where you're being asked to discuss the advantages and the disadvantages and to give your opinion about the situation. So this is one where I never saw a question like this when I was an examiner. I've never seen Cambridge materials or materials from IDP or the British Council where this is a type of question. But again, it would be an easy enough type of question to respond to if you had to, and so I will mention it. But again, these first two types, what are the advantages and disadvantages of blah, blah, blah? Or is this situation more advantageous or disadvantageous? And the way that is phrased. So like most of lessons 5 through 9 about the different essay types, there's a lot of information which is written in the lesson notes and appears underneath the video on the website, IELTScompass.com. So I recommend that you have a look at that. It's a good idea to have a look at it before you watch the video, but you can also watch the video first and then go back over it later. And then, don't forget, for these types of lessons, there's so much information in them, so many things to keep track of and think about. For most people, kind of going over the material more than once is absolutely necessary, even for native English speakers. So there's really a lot of things to think about when you're writing an essay if you need a high score. And so, kind of going back and forth between watching the video and having a look at the lesson notes is important. This is also an essay type where, using a 4-paragraph structure works pretty well for nearly every question I've seen. That doesn't mean you can't make some adjustments to that based on your own approach or based on a particular question you get. It just means that 4 paragraphs tends to work pretty well in most situations for most students. And keep that in mind when we're talking about these questions. The number of paragraphs is kind of irrelevant as long as you have logically structured your essay and have presented the information, types of information you need to present in the way you need to present them. So again, an introduction is a place where you introduce the topic and say what you're going to do in your essay. A body paragraph is a place where you present those ideas that support your point of view or explain a problem or offer a solution in such a way that you've done it in a believable, convincing, detailed way. In IELTS terminology, you've offered a developed, well-developed response. And a conclusion, of course, is just where we draw conclusions about what we think about the essay and why, where we summarize our ideas and leave the last thing that we leave in the examiner's mind is what our ideas on the essay were and why we think what we think, because those are so important in terms of satisfying the requirements of the question that's what we want the examiner to be thinking about when we finish. Okay, so let's have a look. So like with the other lessons, you might want to pause your video, have a look at the question, and then think about what would your response be. So again, the ideas that we talk about are not particularly important. It's what you would do with them and how you would structure the essay and how you would use those ideas for these types of questions. So pause your video if you like, and then unpause when you're ready. So international tourism has brought enormous benefit to many places. At the same time, there is concern about its impact on local inhabitants and the environment. Do the disadvantages of international tourism outweigh the advantages? Okay, so one question students commonly have is, do you need to mention both advantages and disadvantages for this type of question? Like you could say, yes, they do, and then just talk about disadvantages. That would generally answer the question that's been asked. However, the fact that they mention both of them kind of seems to imply that you're being asked to talk about both of them. They mention both benefit and concern, right? So benefit, advantages and disadvantages are mentioned in the question. So generally, a conservative doesn't mean it's impossible to write it that way, the way that I just mentioned, by just talking about one or the other. However, it's much easier to mention them both. And if you think about in the same way that it's good to talk about, to mention the other point of view in an opinion essay, even if you're very strongly for the advantages of something over the disadvantages of something, mentioning both will give you a more developed, more well-rounded, more well-considered, more well-thought-out position, and will support your view in a way that is much stronger than if you just ignore one side and just talk about the other side. And again, that's all really important, particularly if you need a high score like Band 8 or even Band 7. A second kind of point of confusion is the plural aspect. Do the disadvantages, plural, of international tourism outweigh the advantages, plural? So when this video is made in August of 2020, one idea talking about one advantage and one disadvantage is acceptable as long as it's done in adequate detail to offer adequate support to your point of view. However, there's also some confusion not only among students and teachers about this, but also among inexperienced IELTS examiners. And to be conservative, I would stick with plural advantages and plural disadvantages in this type of question for two reasons. Number one, if you do get an inexperienced examiner who is approaching the question this way, you won't have any problems. Again, if that did happen, you could always ask for a remark, and a senior examiner would not make the same mistake, but it's best to avoid a remark request. It's a lot of stress and time and potential expense that you don't want to have to deal with. So you can avoid that. Also, for most people, coming up with a single idea and developing that to the degree necessary so that it applies an appropriate level of support to your point of view in the question is much more difficult than coming up with two ideas and using both of those to support your point of view. If you come up with two ideas, you've got to say a bit less about each one. It doesn't mean your essay is going to be longer. It simply means that, like let's say there are 4 sentences in your paragraph. If you've got one idea, that's 4 sentences or pieces of information about one idea, or it's 2 about 2 ideas, essentially. And again, most people find it fairly easy to come up with several things, advantages, and several things as disadvantages, and then going into a bit of detail and explaining how those are related to the point that you're making. It's generally enough to have. You'll have plenty of time to do that with a couple of sentences, and using 2 ideas. It's absolutely not the case that you should only use one idea. If you can, and you're practiced at doing that, and you can do it successfully, do it, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with doing that at this point. But there's no reason to say that you must do that, that your ideas will not be developed enough if you only have one advantage, if you have 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages. And if you look in the backs of the Cambridge books, you'll see the example essays prepared by examiners. I don't think there's a single one that has only one idea. They usually mention 2, or they mention related ideas. But if it weren't possible to develop your answer properly by using 2 ideas, you wouldn't see that in the Cambridge books. And if it were required to only use one idea and develop in such detail to get a high score, then it wouldn't be the case that there are none or almost no examples listed like this in the Cambridge books. So let's think about our introduction. We're going to mention the things that are mentioned in the question, the benefits tourism has brought to places, and the possible negative effects on the local environment and local people. And this is a type of advantage-disadvantage essay where our opinion needs to be included and it needs to be clear. So we need to choose one side or the other, whether we're comparing advantages and disadvantages, and overall, in your opinion, is the situation as a whole more advantageous than disadvantageous? And it's a bit more logical to organize your body paragraphs with the view that you agree with coming second. So it's not required. There are other ways to do it, but for most people, setting aside the view that you don't agree with, setting that out, and then moving into the view that you agree with, it's a bit more, the flow of your essay is a bit smoother and a bit more logical if you do that. So let's say I'm going to say the disadvantages outweigh the advantages of international tourism. So my first body paragraph will be talking about advantages, and then I'm going to talk about disadvantages. Whereas if I thought the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, my first body paragraph would be a bit better if it talked about the disadvantages, and then my second body paragraph were about the advantages. So one thing to think about in this question is normally, I mean, in this particular question, they're quite specific about two things. So local inhabitants and the environment. So those aren't just examples. Those are the two specific disadvantages you have to talk about. So for local inhabitants, I don't know, it could be the fact that there are people who don't understand their customs in their area all the time, and that causes them problems. For the environment, perhaps added vehicle use or people littering or whatever problem you can imagine tourists causing to the environment. Those are the things that you need to talk about. So let's say I agree that the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. So my first paragraph, I'm going to mention an advantage or two about international tourism. Let's say maybe about employment offered for local people or improvements to the economy, something like that. Now my second body paragraph, I'm going to either say something like, on the other hand, there are disadvantages to local people and the environment from international tourism. That's adequate to talk about those two things in the same paragraph, and that's why you can generally use a 4-paragraph structure for this type of essay. If you think I'm going to talk about the disadvantages to local inhabitants in one paragraph, and in another paragraph the disadvantages to the environment, that would also be fine. If that's easier for you to think about it, there's no reason not to do it that way. So your paragraphing has to be logical. That's a logical way to paragraph. Now, some of the paragraphs are going to be a little bit shorter. That's absolutely fine. Again, you don't really want a 1-sentence paragraph except for perhaps your conclusion. But if you had a paragraph about the advantages of tourism that was a bit longer than your 2 shorter paragraphs about the disadvantages, that would be absolutely fine. Remember that what you need to do is be clear and use an organizational structure which allows you to do that. So if the first example with 2 body paragraphs seems better to you, do that. If the second example where you've got 3 body paragraphs seems better, do that. Whatever helps you think about it more logically and write it more logically and coherently is the thing that you should do. Okay, so here is another question. Sorry, the split on the page, so I've had to move myself. So pause your recording if you want to have a look, and then think about how you would respond. So in some countries, young people are encouraged to work or travel for a year between finishing high school and starting university studies. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages for young people who decide to do this. So a lot of people, when they see this, they're a bit confused because this is something that's fairly common in English-speaking countries. This is not an IELTS question. This is a question from one of Cambridge's IELTS preparation books. So I've seen a lot of students react to this question that way, that what are you talking about? What does this mean? But if you just clearly read the question, so young people are encouraged to work or travel for a year between finishing high school and starting university studies. So they finish high school, take a year and work or travel during that year, and then after that, start university. So if you focus carefully on reading the question and understanding what it's asking you, even if this is something they don't do in your country or you've never heard of this, you can come up with a response without too much difficulty. And again, what they're asking you is discuss the advantages and disadvantages for young people who decide to do this. So take a year after high school and work or travel. The same thing applies in terms of advantages, plural, disadvantages, plural. If you can't think of 2 ideas and you only talk about one, that's fine as long as it's in the appropriate level of detail. But for most people, thinking of 2 is easier and offers them an easier way to come up with a clearly defined position and explanation of the situation. So pause the video and just take a second to think of what ideas would you think of. The reason is that almost every single essay, I've read hundreds of essays to this, maybe even more, maybe thousands to this particular question, and they nearly all come up with exactly the same ideas. So, ready? So the ideas are disadvantages and advantages. Disadvantages are that when people take a year off, they start university later, and that means they're behind everyone else in terms of when they get married, when they have a job, when they finish school, etc. or they just get sidetracked and decide they don't want to go to university and they never make it to university. Those are the two ideas, or one of those two ideas appears in almost every essay I've ever read. As far as advantages, the advantages are they can travel and experience other cultures, and the other advantage that people mention is that if you work, you can save some money to help you while you're at university. So this is one example of a question where the ideas are almost always the same. You wouldn't have to use those ideas. They're just easy and most people think of them. Examiners don't care if they sit down with a stack of essays to mark and they see the same ideas over and over and over and over again. And they're not going to give those essays the same marks. The idea has very little to do with it. So it's got to be relevant, which those ideas are, but your score is mainly based on how you develop the idea, how you present the idea, and how you make your own position clear in relation to the question with that idea or with those ideas. So in terms of structure, this would be pretty easy to fit into 4 paragraphs. The first introduction, and again, introduce the topic. I'm going to talk about a situation where people work between high school and university and the advantages and disadvantages, the benefits and the drawbacks of that, something like that. You might mention those benefits or drawbacks briefly, or you might not. As long as you are introducing the topic and saying what you're going to do, that's enough. First body paragraph, advantages. Second body paragraph, disadvantages, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. But again, talk about the advantages of doing it and the disadvantages of doing it. Your conclusion is going to sum up your ideas, summarize the ideas that you've had about advantages, disadvantages, and that's it. Some people have asked, can I put my opinion in this question? And the answer is basically, yes, you can. It's not required. They're not specifically asking for your opinion. Most people think of their opinion as their position, and they know that position is very important in IELTS, but your position here is simply what you believe an advantage to be. In your opinion, what a disadvantage is. So you don't have to write, I believe an advantage of this is, or I think a disadvantage of this is, but the fact that you're writing these advantages and these disadvantages and not some other ones is indication that your position is that these are the advantages and these are the disadvantages. So you don't need a separate part where you mention your opinion about this. Having said that, no IELTS essay makes it impossible for you to put your opinion in when they're not asking for it. So if you give a relevant, brief opinion in relation to what you've written, that's absolutely fine. So again, like if you think it makes it easier for you to write the essay this way, then do it. If you don't, there's no reason to do it, and you don't need to. Okay, so you might want to pause your video if you'd like to have a look before continuing. So some believe that it's better for children to be learning a foreign language at primary schools rather than secondary school. Do the advantages of this outweigh the disadvantages? So again, this is a question that requires your opinion explicitly, and you're essentially being asked, is one of these situations, which one of these situations is more advantageous than the other? Again, you're going to talk about both advantages and disadvantages to the particular situation, but your opinion needs to be included as to which one is more advantageous, whether the situation is more advantageous or more disadvantageous. That particular situation, in this case, is beginning to learn a foreign language at primary school. So what are the advantages of that? Beginning to learn a foreign language at primary school, and what are the disadvantages of beginning to learn a foreign language at primary school? So they mention secondary school, but you don't need to talk about the advantages of learning a language at primary school versus the advantages of learning one at secondary school. So you might be able to do that for this particular question, but generally that's just giving you some context of like, this is the situation we're talking about rather than this situation, secondary school, which is currently what happens in most places. Unlike the question about international tourism, where they mentioned 2 disadvantages, they said for local people, local inhabitants, and for the environment, and you've got to talk about those. This one is just more general. So again, I would pick 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages for the reasons I've mentioned, but you can be more general. And for that reason, for this one, a 4-paragraph structure would work very, very well. And you could use something different, but like for a question like this, that it works so well. I would get in the habit of, if a 4-paragraph structure works well and you can do it, just because it streamlines the writing process and it makes everything go more smoothly and it makes your message very effective. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the website, have a look at 2 advantage, disadvantages essays, one for each of these types. Okay, so here's our first one. In some countries, governments are encouraging businesses and industries to move to regional areas outside the big cities. Do the advantages of this trend outweigh the disadvantages? Okay, so we know it's the type where we have to state our opinion about whether this is a more advantageous or more disadvantageous situation. In terms of the topic, is it a good idea for governments to encourage businesses to move to regional areas outside big cities? So we're going to talk about some advantages of doing that and some disadvantages. Again, if you can think of two of each, that's great. And it will make the writing process a bit easier for most people, possibly the marking process for most examiners. And if you can't, sticking to one idea is also acceptable. Sticking to one idea is also acceptable, assuming you have an appropriate level of detail. So we're going to set out the topic and what we're going to do. Let's have a look at the introduction. There are both benefits and drawbacks to companies relocating to less populated areas outside the main cities, but I believe governments should encourage this type of activity for the improvements that would be seen as a result for rural and urban residents and the corporations as well. Okay, so the question, have I introduced the topic and said what I'm going to do? Benefits and drawbacks to companies relocating to less populated areas. Again, I'm mainly paraphrasing this question. The language I've used meets the task, meets the requirements, communicates my ideas clearly. If you came up with something different that had the same meaning and you were paraphrasing, that would also be fine. As long as you introduce the topic, that's fine. You don't necessarily need to paraphrase in the way that people do sometimes, as long as the topic is clear and what you're going to do is clear. So I've said that there are benefits and drawbacks, and then my opinion is clear. And I've gone into some detail. So I believe governments should encourage this type of activity for the improvements that would be seen as a result for rural and urban residents and the corporations as well. So I'm going to talk about benefits for the people who work and live in rural areas and for the corporations. So you should expect that when you see that in the introduction, those ideas will be included later in the essay. And if they aren't, that's a problem. So anything you mention specifically in your introduction has got to be discussed in greater detail later. Okay, so the main disadvantage of moving a business or factory to a more regional location would, of course, be the costs associated with the relocation. What's the point of my body paragraph is to present the ideas that I think are disadvantages in this situation. So any large enterprise would likely need to build new facilities, and this would incur significant costs. There would also be training and orientation costs for new and relocating employees, as well as a potential temporary decrease in productivity inherent in such a major change in employees' day-to-day workflow. So essentially, all of that is stating one idea, cost, and then different ideas about the ways it would cost more. So I've got more than one disadvantages, costs, that's my overall theme, and then cost of relocation, cost of training, cost of building new facilities, etc., etc., etc. So there's plenty of development there, plenty of variety to this idea of cost. And then, if you've seen the lesson on opinion essays, I talk about mentioning the other point of view, how that can help develop your ideas and really help you if you need a high score, 7 or above, particularly for band 8. If we look at the last sentence here, however, more modern and efficient factories and offices could offset some of these costs, and governments could also offer financial incentives in the form of corporate tax relief for companies willing to undertake such a move. So in this case, I've said, these are the disadvantages, but in the introduction I said I think that those are minor and that mainly this is an advantageous situation for everybody involved. And so the disadvantages I've mentioned are real, and I've acknowledged that they're real, but I've also said that I've considered these when coming up with my opinion that this is a more advantageous situation, and this is why I still think that even though these are disadvantages, that the situation overall is advantageous. So costs will go up, but there will also be benefits of these increased costs. Essentially, that's what I'm saying. And I also mentioned, one of the ways that governments could encourage companies to do this, which, and the question mentions governments, industry, businesses, etc. So everything is right on track. So if we have a look at second one, advantages. The advantages of corporations relocating to regions outside of urban areas would, however, be significant for urban centers, regional areas, and the corporations themselves. So that's my topic sentence, and what I'm going to say is I'm going to mention three benefits. One for the urban centers that corporations are asked to move from, another for the regional areas they're being asked to move to, and then another benefit for the corporations themselves. So that's my topic sentence, and that means that those are the things and only the things I'm going to talk about in this paragraph if I do my job correctly. So much of the overcrowding seen in major cities in recent decades is due to the migration of rural populations in search of employment, so offering employment opportunities could potentially stem this flow. This would not only, so again, further explaining that the reasons for the things that I've set up here, these benefits for these three groups. This would not only create jobs for rural people, but also relieve some of the pressures caused by urban overcrowding. I've explained what the benefit is to two of the groups, to urban centers and to regional areas. So increased employment for regional areas, less crowding for urban areas. Finally, as the cost of renting, building, and maintenance tend to be lower in rural areas, the long-term benefits to the corporate bottom line are also clear. So again, the financial benefits for companies is also clear. So I've very clearly mentioned three benefits, three advantages to three different groups, and gone over those in enough detail that I've met the requirement for a well-developed idea. So this is a good example of an essay that doesn't really have any traditional examples. For example, blah, 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 blah. It essentially just has description and explanation, and you could probably turn some of these into examples. So for example, I could say, for example, much of the overcrowding seen in major cities in recent decades is due to the migration of rural populations, blah, 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 blah. So that all that means is that, the support that you offer to back up your ideas has to be relevant and appropriate. Examples are one way to do that. This is an example of an essay which simply uses description, detail, explanation in a way that gets the point across. And so there's some confusion. I think there's a lot of confusion about you must use examples, because in the questions, in the instructions for the question, examples are mentioned. And like I've said, examples can be a great way to illustrate your points and to develop your ideas, but they are not a required way to do it. So if you easily think of examples in a particular situation, use them if they're relevant. If you don't, this is a good example of, supporting material which is not specific examples, but is relevant to the point. Okay, going to the conclusion. While there would be some transient logistical concerns to contend with, I am of the opinion that the overall long-term impact of encouraging such a move would be overwhelmingly positive for all stakeholders involved. Okay, so my conclusion, have I restated my ideas in a way that draws some conclusions about the situation, about what I think, and has left in the mind of the examiner what my ideas are and why I think them? So the answer here, if you think about it, so I basically said there are some minor issues with some disadvantages with moving to a different area, but the overall effect would be good, and that's why I think it's a good idea for everybody involved. So again, I've done all I need to do there, and there are lots of different ways you could come up with the same sentiment or express the ideas in your own essay. This is the language that I've used according to what was in my mind for this particular essay at that particular time when I wrote it, according to my level of English, and that's all you need to do also. If you scroll down on the website, you'll see a second version with important words and phrases highlighted. I'm not going to go over these specifically because in lessons 5, 6, and 8, I went into quite a bit of detail about, the importance of these things, cohesive devices, what referencing devices are, what types of vocabulary are considered less common. So I would recommend that you look at the essay on the website, if you have any questions about what these things are and how they're used, and also, you can get some ideas for vocabulary that you can use in other essays on a similar topic, but I'm not going to go into specific detail because there is one more essay in this, and that is this one, where you're simply being asked to talk about advantages and disadvantages of a situation without your opinion. So maybe pause the video and think about how you would answer this question. Okay, today more and more tourists are visiting places where conditions are difficult, such as the Sahara Desert or the Antarctic. What are the benefits and disadvantages for tourists who visit such places? Okay, so this is pretty clearly simply talking about, what the situation is and what are some advantages of the situation, what are some disadvantages of the situation. Where people might get confused in a question like this is sometimes, so earlier in the video when I talked about the question about international tourism, and they mentioned disadvantages for problems for local inhabitants or problems for the environment, you've got to talk about those two things. There are other questions where they mention something just as an example of a phenomenon, and you don't have to talk about those specific things, but you have to talk about what they are an example of. So if you look at this question, what's the situation that you need to talk about advantages and disadvantages of? Is it the Sahara Desert and visiting the Antarctic? No. If you look more closely, more and more tourists are visiting places where conditions are difficult. Okay, so that's what you need to talk about. The advantages of visiting a place where conditions are difficult and the disadvantages of visiting a place where conditions are difficult. So you can imagine if I just said that without any examples to explain what I mean by difficult conditions, it might be difficult to know exactly what I'm talking about. But if I choose two places that are famous for having difficult conditions, being very hot and dry and isolated, and being very cold and dry and isolated, the Sahara Desert and the Antarctic, then it's clear what I mean by a place with difficult conditions. So you don't need to mention these in your essay. You could, again, sometimes people paraphrase, and in this situation, they'll just use those words again, or use those places again, or choose two different places that are similar. You don't really need to. You just need to explain in your introduction what you're going to do. So what you're going to do is discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of what the topic is about. And this particular topic is about traveling to places with difficult conditions. So let's look at our introduction. Do we do that? Travelers today are seeking out more remote and adventurous destinations, and these locations often have severe conditions. Okay, so again, I've kind of defined the Sahara Desert and Antarctic as remote and adventurous destinations and talked about severe conditions. So there we are. There's the idea. With this shift in tourism come new challenges and new rewards. And while the novelty of visiting such places and their natural beauty are certainly enticing, factors such as increased cost and danger also require careful consideration. So again, I've gone into quite a lot of detail here. So with this shift in tourism come new challenges and new rewards. So these are new challenges, disadvantages, new rewards, advantages. While the novelty of visiting such places and their natural beauty are certainly enticing. So that's what I'm going to talk about. You can expect when you get to the body paragraphs, I'm going to talk about the novelty or the unique experience of visiting a place like that and the natural beauty that you would find in a place like that. So those are my advantages. Factors such as increased cost and danger also require careful consideration. So that tells you that I'm going to talk about increased cost and danger. Those are my disadvantages that I'm going to mention. Now, that's just how I decided to do it here. I could also just say, this shift in tourism means that there are both new challenges and new rewards for today's tourists. Essentially, I'm saying what I'm going to talk about now, the challenges and the rewards, the disadvantages and the advantages, the drawbacks and the benefits for tourists. I haven't gone into as much detail, but it's very clear what I'm going to write about. Now, this is a bit more clear, it's a bit more detailed, but really one of the most important decisions you have to make when you're thinking about things like this is how effectively can you do it. So if you can write a sentence like this where you explain concisely, clearly what you're going to talk about in your essay, it's a bit better than if you just take a more general approach, like the second example I said about with this shift in tourism come new challenges and new rewards, full stop. So it is a little bit better, but if you take the other situation where maybe I would try something like this, and because of the linguistic challenges, I'd make a bunch of mistakes, and it would have been much easier if I just stuck to the simpler version, that is better than making all these mistakes. So again, a little less detail, because you can, as long as you tell the examiner what you're going to talk about and make that clear, and then later you talk about it, that's absolutely fine. So again, any small benefit you could get from this could be offset by a penalty for inaccurate language use or inappropriate language use. So again, this is something you really need to think about for your own situation whenever you're practicing an essay or especially in the exam. Okay, so I'm going to expect to talk about advantages and disadvantages. So visiting locations with harsh conditions is an attractive option for many tourists. Topic sentence, I'm going to talk about the advantages. These locations are often off the beaten track, and as the world grows more crowded, the possibility of visiting places of natural beauty in their pristine state, unspoiled by crowds of other tourists, is tempting. So there's one, natural beauty. Visiting a place that's beautiful isn't crowded. So there's my first advantage. Second idea, interest in these places is also growing because they offer unique experiences that can make memories for a lifetime. While the challenges of getting to such locations are certainly real, travelers who take the trouble to reach these areas are rewarded with magnificent riches that cannot be encountered elsewhere. This is my second advantage. I've also acknowledged the disadvantage. So again, this is what IELTS is talking about when they're talking about, discussing both points of view. So again, I'm not taking the other point of view. I'm just acknowledging that that is a disadvantage. And I've thought about that when coming up with my own ideas. So while the challenges of getting to such locations are certainly real, I'm saying, yes, that is a problem. But if you can get beyond that, there are some real benefits for you. So if you look at what kind of information is in that paragraph, it's really just an explanation of each of the two advantages and why that they are advantages. And in the second one, even why it's an advantage in spite of the fact that there are some difficulties involved with this type of travel. Okay, so I've talked about my advantages for travelers. Now we're going to talk about the disadvantages. On the other hand, transition, signal. Now I'm going to talk about something different. Costs and the potential dangers involved with adventure travel are clear drawbacks. So again, very clear topic sentence about what I'm going to talk about, how many things, and what you should expect is information about the cost of this kind of travel and the danger involved with this kind of travel. So visiting deserts, mountain ranges, far-flung islands, or other similarly distant locations means the cost of transport to get to these places is significantly higher, not to mention the potential additional cost of gear, transport, and guides after arriving. So there you are. First idea, examples of costs associated with the travel. Also, in addition to the greater risk of danger when spending time in an area with extreme conditions, remote locations offer fewer options if something does go wrong. Health facilities, food and water or rescue may be far off and difficult to reach in the event of an accident or other difficulties encountered. Description of the dangers involved. And if you look at the first part of the sentence, also, in addition to the greater risk of danger when spending time in an area with extreme conditions. So I haven't said, these are places that are dangerous. Also, in addition to them being dangerous, that essentially you've got 40 minutes. So you don't want to include any information that's really obvious. The question has mentioned the Sahara Desert and the Antarctic. I've mentioned deserts, mountain ranges, far-flung islands, distant locations. It's very clear that we're talking about places that have an increased level of danger, and anybody who thinks about this would recognize that. So you don't necessarily have to go into a really in-depth explanation of every single aspect of the idea, as long as it's clear. So if I were talking about something that, it weren't clear that the place I was talking about was dangerous, I would have to explain why it's dangerous. But because the kinds of places that the question is asking about are very obviously dangerous, that's not necessary. And I can focus in my example more about the specific types of danger that you would find in the situation. So this is, again, you've got limited time, and think about being concise. Concise just means direct and detailed at the same time. So finally, what do we have? In conclusion, the rewards of traveling to areas with challenging conditions are clearly a reason for their popularity. So the benefits are why they're popular, but travel to such places must involve careful preparation to balance the significant costs and added risk that such travel entails. Okay, so I've mentioned both the advantages and the disadvantages, and that if you're going to go to these places, you really need to think about these disadvantages. So I haven't taken a position as like it's a good idea to go to them or it's not, simply that if you decide to, you do need to be careful. Now, again, you've got below this, you've got the same essay with this type of information, with these types of words and phrases. underlined. Now there's no opinion language, and I'm not going to go into detail about each one for the reason I mentioned before at the end of the last essay, but it would be a good idea to have a look. Now, this kind of mythical question that I mentioned, the discuss both views and give your own opinion, that I said, I've never seen that. I've never seen it in official materials. Again, it could exist. Perhaps I've just missed it, but I looked very carefully because I want to be accurate in the information that I give, and I didn't find it. But I also thought about it and realized, like, there's no reason you couldn't have a question like that in the test. Now, if you think about if this were that question, discuss the advantages and disadvantages and give your own opinion. So discuss the advantages and disadvantages for tourists who visit such places and give your own opinion. This is kind of like a discussion essay now. So if you did get this type of question, rather than panicking, you could think like, how could I do that? How could I do that easily and logically? And you could think, so, all right, I've got to give advantages and I've got to give disadvantages and I've got to talk about my opinion. So maybe an easy way to do that would be introduction, conclusion are the same. Advantages, one paragraph, disadvantages, another paragraph. And like a discussion essay, I could put my opinion about the situation in a separate paragraph. So that's very clear what my opinion is. Again, this is just how you should be thinking when things like this happen. So introduction here, followed by advantages, followed by disadvantages, followed by an opinion, then followed by a conclusion. And again, you could go into a bit less detail if that happened because you're being asked to do more than simply talk about advantages and disadvantages. And you're being asked to do it again in the same minimum of 250 words. So that's something you could think about if that happened to you. There are lots of situations where a question comes up which is slightly different. It's worded in a slightly different way. And rather than being confused and panicking, just read it carefully and think about what you know and how you can apply what you know to that situation that will result in your ideas and your point of view being clearly detailed and clearly stated in a way that you're meeting what the question is asking you to do and you're making the examiner happy so that he or she can give you the mark that you deserve. All right, so there you have two different types of advantages, disadvantages essays, and how you could approach either of them, and also how you might approach any kind of difficulties that pop up in the exam or while you're preparing with questions that are slightly different than what you're used to. So the most important thing to remember is that all you've got to do is read the question carefully, understand exactly what it's asking you to do, and then do that so that you can meet the requirements of the question according to the band descriptors. And if you do that, you'll always be giving the examiner what they're looking for and what they need to see in order to give you the band score you deserve for your essay.